Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something a little offbeat. Picture this, you're standing face to face with a samurai, ready for a duel. The tension's thick. The sound of your heartbeat almost drowns out everything else. You raise your sword, they raise theirs. But here's the kicker, this isn't just a fight of skill. No. This is a duel where strategy, trickery, and subtle psychological tactics play as big a role as your sword's edge. Samurai, these legendary warriors, you've probably imagined as stoic. Honor-bound figures often used some seriously unusual tactics to win battles. And you, my friend, probably won't survive this so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time so we can share the experience. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, let's get started. When you think about samurai duels, you probably picture two skilled warriors facing off in an epic clash of swords. It's all about who's quicker, who's stronger, who's got the best technique, right? Well, you'd be wrong. In many cases, the samurai were just as interested in winning without even having to fight at all. That's right. These legendary warriors, known for their brutal efficiency, would often deploy strange tactics to win before their opponents even raised a blade. Take, for example, the power of distraction. Samurai understood that the mind played as much a part in a duel as the sword. A distracted warrior was a defeated warrior. In some cases, the mere act of talking could be enough to throw an opponent off balance. Imagine standing there, ready to strike, when your enemy suddenly drops an unexpected comment like, "Is that all you've got?" Or "You'll never survive this." These little jabs weren't just insults, they were designed to crack the mental armor, to make you second guess yourself. And in those precious moments of hesitation, the duel was often decided. But wait, it gets even stranger. Historians still argue whether some samurai would actually use fake bravado as a tactic. Picture this, a samurai purposely exaggerating their movements, puffing up their chest, making wild gestures with their sword, acting like they were far more powerful than they truly were. Why? To make their opponent think they were facing someone far more dangerous than they really were. The idea was to make your adversary second guess their confidence and stall them long enough to get the upper hand. Now, dimly lit streets and soft, threatening murmurs might not sound like the most effective battlefield tactics. But for samurai, this was a carefully cultivated art of war. It wasn't just about defeating an opponent with swordplay, it was about mentally dismantling them. Before the fight even started, you're still there, standing in that quiet street, eyes locked with your opponent. But here's where things get interesting, because now this fight is all about the mind game. Imagine your enemy watching you closely, perhaps even feeling confident in their skill, when suddenly you do something totally unexpected. You begin to act overconfident, maybe even a little cocky. You raise your sword, take a deep breath, and give them the look of someone who's already won. Sounds like a strategy for failure, right? Well, for some samurai, it was actually a brilliant way to win a duel. You see, samurai were not just warriors, they were masters of psychology. They knew that sometimes appearing stronger than you really were could be the ultimate weapon. By exuding excessive confidence, a samurai could make their opponent believe they were facing an undefeatable force. And once that seed of doubt was planted in the other person's mind, it was often all over. The opponent might hesitate, second guess their own abilities, and in the worst case scenario, freeze up entirely. All it took was a simple shift in attitude. And bam, the duel was decided before either side even swung their swords. It sounds A bit like a game of psychological chess, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether this tactic was universally used by samurai or just a clever few. But it's certainly part of the samurai legacy. Some of the greatest swordsmen in history reportedly relied on their ability to appear larger than life. They knew that fear could be just as sharp as a katana, but not all samurai would go for the flashy overconfidence. In fact, some would go the complete opposite route, pretending to be weaker or more vulnerable than they actually were. This wasn't about fake bravado. This was about making your opponent underestimate you, intentionally looking like an easy target. The goal here wasn't to puff up your chest and get cocky. It was to appear unremarkable, even pitiful. Why? Well, imagine this. Your opponent, thinking you're inexperienced or unskilled, charges in for the kill. They're confident, sure, but they're also naive. And when they strike, they find themselves face to face with a warrior who's suddenly far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. This tactic, the appearance of weakness, might sound like a cheesy plot twist, but it was a trick that worked wonders. And it's a perfect example of how samurai battles weren't always decided by brute force. Sometimes it was the duel of wits, and the samurai who could outthink their opponent won the day. You might be wondering, could this really work in a modern context? Well, think about it. How often do we see people succeed by simply seeming more competent than they are? It's the same principle, really. But back then, it wasn't just about swagger or fake confidence. It was a finely tuned art. All right, so far we've talked about mental tricks, confidence, and how the samurai would sometimes play with their opponent's head before they even raised their swords. But let's take a step back and look at something even more unusual: how samurai trained in bizarre ways to gain that mental edge. After all, to pull off these stunts in battle, a samurai had to be exceptionally prepared, not just physically, but in ways that might make you raise an eyebrow. Think about it. If you wanted to win, you didn't just need to be strong, you needed to be unpredictable. Some samurai took training to strange extremes. For instance, they didn't just practice with weapons or engage in combat drills, they also spent hours studying the movement patterns of animals. Yes, you heard that right. Samurai would observe birds, insects, and even fish, learning how their bodies moved and adapted to different situations. Why? Well, the samurai believed that mastering the flow of nature could help them adapt faster to unexpected situations. Imagine a duel happening, and suddenly, you're not just thinking like a warrior, you're thinking like a hawk, ready to swoop in for the kill, or like a fish darting away from an attack. Historians still argue whether this kind of animal mimicry was widespread among samurai or a niche technique used by only the most eccentric of warriors. But the idea of drawing inspiration from nature was undeniably part of their culture. It wasn't about becoming a literal animal. It was about adapting to unpredictable scenarios, staying nimble, and fluid in the face of danger. But that's not all. Some samurai also trained under the harshest conditions to build mental and physical toughness. They'd practice in darkness, in total silence, or under the heat of the sun, all in an attempt to push their limits and refine their reflexes. In some cases, they even practiced while barely conscious. Yes, you read that right. Samurai would work themselves to exhaustion, then force their bodies to fight while their minds were clouded by fatigue. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, doesn't it? But the idea was that, in battle, nothing could throw them off, not a lack of sleep, not hunger, not even extreme stress. By training in a constant state of discomfort, they made their bodies react instinctively, allowing them to fight without hesitation. This kind of extreme training wasn't just about physical strength. It was about fortitude. It was about pushing yourself to the brink of your limits so that when it came time to face an opponent, your mind and body would work as one in perfect harmony, even in the most unexpected and chaotic circumstances. And in a duel, well, you can imagine how that would give you the advantage. You could be facing an opponent who's sweating, exhausted, and on the edge of panic while you remain cool, collected, and ready to strike with an unshakable calm. It's the kind of training that could make all the difference between life and death, and it's not surprising that the samurai were masters of this kind of preparation. Now, let's dive into one of the more fascinating aspects of samurai duels: psychological warfare. Sure, you've got the blade in hand, your opponent's right there, and the tension in the air could cut through steel. But what if the real battle wasn't about your sword at all? What if it was all about controlling the other person's mind? That's where the art of mental manipulation came in. Samurai were masters of this, and they knew that a well-timed insult or dramatic gesture could completely throw their opponent off balance. Picture this: you're standing there in the heat of a duel, your focus sharp, your grip tight around your katana. But then suddenly your opponent says something completely unexpected. Maybe it's a snide comment, something meant to insult your honor, or perhaps it's a laugh, a small sound of amusement as they size you up. What do you do? Do you react? Do you let the anger flare up inside you? Or do you let it slide off like water off a duck's back? Well, samurai knew exactly how to respond, and they often used insults to bait their opponents into reacting. It wasn't just about what was said, either. Samurai would use their body language, their posture, to provoke or unsettle their opponent. A sudden step forward, an exaggerated yawn, or even a completely unexpected move could throw someone off their game. Imagine an opponent standing tall and rigid, thinking they've got everything under control, only for you to make a sudden, offhand gesture, like twirling your sword in the air or slapping it against your armor. The effect: they might freeze for a split second, suddenly unsure of what to expect next. And in that split second, that's when you strike. Historians still argue whether such tactics were universally effective, or if they were just clever tricks used by a few savvy samurai. But they certainly weren't without precedent. This kind of mental manipulation wasn't just about insults. It was about subtly undermining your opponent's confidence, making them second-guess every move they made. In the heat of a duel, just a single moment of hesitation could be all it took to flip the tables. You can imagine it if you were the one who was insulted. Your ego would take a hit. Suddenly, it's no longer about just winning the fight, it's about defending your pride. And in those precious moments when you're caught up in defending your honor, you're not paying attention to the fight anymore. You're distracted, and in that moment, your samurai opponent could strike. But it wasn't always just insults. Samurai were also masters of dramatic gestures. A quick swipe of the sword, a loud clash of armor, or a flash of movement. These were all ways to unsettle an opponent, to make them doubt their own reflexes. The samurai didn't just want to win, they wanted to control the flow of the duel, to be the one in charge of the tempo and rhythm. And if you're able to make your opponent feel out of control, even for a second, you've already won half the battle. Now, let's get a little unorthodox. We've talked about psychological tricks, confidence, and insults. But here's one that'll leave you scratching your head. Some samurai would intentionally use unconventional weapons, things that weren't swords at all, to mess with their opponent's mind. Yeah, you heard that right. These weren't just warriors wielding the sharpest katanas sometimes. They'd show up with broken swords, wooden sticks, or even the oddest of all, no weapon at all. Sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? But this wasn't just a bizarre quirk. It was a strategic move. The idea was simple. By using what appeared to be inferior or makeshift weapons, the samurai could trick their opponents into underestimating them. Imagine you're facing off against someone with a katana, the legendary weapon of the samurai, and you've got, say, a short stick or a battered blade. What's the first thing your opponent is going to think? I've got this in the bag. And in that moment, that confidence is the key to the entire strategy. Let's say your opponent assumes you're an inexperienced warrior because of your shabby weapon. They charge in, full of bravado, ready to deliver a decisive blow. And then, right when they least expect it, you do something they never saw coming. You disarm them with that flimsy stick. Or maybe you use the broken sword in a way they never anticipated. They're left stunned, watching as their supposed victory crumbles. All because they underestimated your resourcefulness. Historians still debate whether this technique was really a common practice or just an occasional trick, pulled by a few clever samurai. But it's certainly in line with the mindset of the warrior class. The samurai were constantly looking for ways to turn the tables, to make the fight play out on their terms. It wasn't just about strength or skill, it was about using whatever resources you had, no matter how unconventional, to your advantage. And if that meant pulling a weight, what? Move with a wooden stick? Well, so be it. This was just another example of how the samurai mastered the art of deception, of making sure their opponents never had the upper hand. By appearing weak or underprepared, they baited their enemies into making the first mistake. And once that mistake was made, it was game over. It's easy to see this as a cheap trick. But in the world of samurai duels, it was just another calculated move in a much larger game of mental chess. The idea was to disarm your opponent not just physically, but mentally. And if that meant using something as humble as a broken sword, then that's exactly what you do. Let's go back to basics for a minute, shall we? The samurai were skilled with swords, yes. But what if I told you that in some duels, they would actively avoid using their weapons at all? That's right, sometimes. They relied on hand-to-hand combat, or the classic throw the opponent off balance move. Picture yourself in a tight situation, your sword drawn, and then just when you think you're about to land a strike, your opponent surprises you. With a swift move, they grab your wrist, push you back, or even use your own momentum against you. In those moments, you'd be forced to use your body and instincts to react. And let me tell you, the samurai were experts at exactly that. This wasn't some random happenstance. Samurai were well-versed in grappling and throwing techniques, using their body weight, quick reflexes, and awareness of their opponent's movements to get the upper hand. You'd think that the duel was all about swords, but sometimes it was. More about feeling the other person's energy, understanding their every move before they even made it. One samurai might appear passive, even vulnerable, and then they'd use your own strike to disarm you and leave you on the ground. It wasn't about fighting fair. It was about using everything at your disposal. Historians still argue about the extent to which samurai incorporated grappling into their duels. Some scholars believe it was an essential part of their martial arts training, while others argue it was more of a last resort. But regardless of where you stand on that debate, it's clear that the samurai didn't just rely on their swords. They knew that in a duel, it wasn't just about the weapon, it was about the warrior behind it. One of the most famous examples of this type of dueling comes from the famous samurai Miyamoto Musashi, who fought multiple duels throughout his life. Musashi, known for his unmatched skill with the sword, was also notorious for his ability to adapt his fighting style based on the situation. During one of his duels, he showed up late intentionally. He knew his opponent, a highly skilled swordsman, would be expecting a battle of pure technique. But Musashi, instead of immediately drawing his katana, use his body language to throw off his opponent's rhythm. Musashi's strategy wasn't about striking first, it was about making his opponent feel the pressure of the duel before it even began. And when the time came, Musashi didn't just fight with his sword, he fought with his mind. And that's what made samurai duels so unpredictable and so fascinating. There was no one formula for success. Sure, skill with a sword mattered, but mental fortitude, adaptability, and the ability to read your opponent's movements could often decide the outcome. Samurai understood that combat was as much about the mind as it was about the body. Speaking of unpredictability, let's take a look at another strange and somewhat comical tactic used in samurai duels. The unexpected pause. Picture this. You're locked in a fight, swords clashing, the tension in the air nearly tangible, when suddenly, your opponent comes to a complete stop. They don't just hesitate for a second, they completely freeze. They stand still, take a deep breath, and look around as if pondering something deep and meaningful. And you, as the person facing them, are left in total confusion. What do? Do you stand still too, unsure of what's happening? Do you attack? Or do you wait to see if this is some trick? It's moments like these that could completely turn the tide of a duel. This odd tactic was sometimes used by samurai to disorient or confuse their opponent, often with the goal of throwing them off their rhythm. Imagine you're facing off against someone who's fast, strong, and skilled, and then suddenly, without warning, they freeze. They don't even look at you. They look off into the distance, like they're lost in thought. It's disorienting. What's going on? Are they just tired? Are they trying to trick you? In that split second of uncertainty, your mind is thrown into chaos. And it's in that exact moment of confusion that the samurai could strike. Historians still argue whether this tactic was really part of the formal samurai dueling tradition, or if it was just a few clever, eccentric warriors making it their own. Either way, it's one of those weird moves that could throw even the most seasoned fighter off balance. In fact, many scholars point out that a duel wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about timing and mental control. The samurai knew that controlling the pace of a duel was just as important as knowing how to swing a sword. And if that meant freezing in place for a few moments to mess with your opponent's head, so be it. But there's a deeper psychological trick at play here, too. When a samurai suddenly stops, they're not just creating confusion, they're taking control of the situation. They're forcing you to react to them instead of allowing you to dictate the pace of the fight. They're putting you in a position where you feel uncertain, hesitant, and unsure of how to proceed. And once you're in that headspace, well, they've already won the battle for mental control. In the heat of a duel, it's easy to get wrapped up in the action, your sword moving in perfect synchrony with your body, the adrenaline pumping through your veins. But samurai understood that sometimes it wasn't about the fight itself, it was about the space between each strike, the moments where the mind could wander and the opponent could be thrown off balance. Now that we've covered some of the mind games, let's switch gears for a moment and look at another odd but effective tactic: the use of rituals in duels. That's right, the samurai weren't just warriors, they were also keenly aware of the importance of ceremonial customs. And believe it or not, some samurai would use these rituals to gain a psychological advantage before a fight even started. One of the most peculiar rituals was the bowing a simple gesture. That could hold a lot of weight in a duel. Traditionally, samurai were expected to bow to each other before engaging in combat, not just as a sign of respect, but as a means of setting the tone. It was a ritual that helped establish honor, a way of acknowledging the seriousness of what was about to take place. But some samurai, ever the clever strategists would use this moment of protocol to their advantage. For example, imagine two samurai face to face, about to begin a duel. They both bow, but one of them doesn't bow in the usual way. Perhaps they bow a little too deeply, or maybe they take a little longer than necessary. It seems innocent, right? But that slight, almost imperceptible deviation could plant a seed of doubt in their opponent's mind. Why are they bowing like that? Your opponent might wonder, what does that mean? Are they trying to trick me? In that moment, the samurai performing the unusual bow could be planting uncertainty, getting inside their opponent's head before the duel even begins. Historians still argue about how often these psychological plays took place in formal duels. Some believe that such rituals were sacrosanct and unlikely to be used for tactical advantage, while others argue that the samurai were always looking for ways to outwit their opponent, even if it meant using the most sacred of traditions against them. Whatever the case, it's clear that samurai understood the power of ritual. It wasn't just about the swords, and the fighting it was about everything that led up to it. Every moment before the first strike. And in those moments, they could use the smallest gesture, the tiniest detail, to plant doubt and gain an edge. But it wasn't always just about bowing. Samurai also understood the psychological power of ritualized speech. Before a duel, they would often speak in formal, almost poetic ways. Some warriors might try to engage in a philosophical discussion, speaking of honor, duty, and fate. Why? To lull their opponent into a sense of complacency, or perhaps to stall, to give themselves time to assess the situation. Other times, they might deliver a cryptic statement or riddle, causing their opponent to wonder about its deeper meaning. It was all part of the game. The duel was as much a battle of wits as it was of strength. All of this, though, was a reflection of the samurai's deep understanding of both honor and mind games. For the samurai, every detail mattered. It wasn't enough to just be the better swordsman, they also had to be the better strategist, the better manipulator. Rituals, customs, and gestures were tools in their arsenal, helping them navigate the psychological landscape of a duel. We've covered psychological tactics, unusual weapons, and even the odd ritual, but now let's dive into something a little more strange. Have you ever heard of samurai using disguises in a duel? I'm not talking about some elaborate ninja trick where they sneak around in the dark, no. This is a much subtler approach. In certain cases, samurai would actually disguise their intentions or even their true identity to gain an advantage. Imagine showing up to a duel dressed as a humble peasant, a farmer, or get this, a monk. Sounds a bit outlandish, doesn't it? But for the samurai, it was just another way to keep their enemies on edge. You see, the samurai were all about maintaining control, and in many ways, that control extended beyond just the fight itself. If you could confuse or mislead your opponent from the very beginning, you'd be able to make them question everything they thought they knew about you. They'd be forced to reassess their strategy, wondering if they were facing a skilled swordsman, or perhaps just some lowly person they could dispatch easily. Historians still debate the extent to which samurai actually used disguises during duels. Some argue that this was more of a myth, something that was exaggerated over time. Others suggest that it wasn't necessarily about hiding their true identity, but rather about misdirecting their opponent's focus. Think about it if you're expecting a fierce, armored samurai, and instead you get someone dressed in plain clothes. You might think you're facing a low-ranked opponent. That perception could throw off your strategy and leave you vulnerable. One famous example involves the samurai swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, who, as legend has it, once fought a duel against an opponent while deliberately appearing unkempt, disheveled, and dare I say, not impressive at all. This, of course, worked to Musashi's advantage. His opponent, expecting a simple, straightforward fight, found himself completely out of sorts when Musashi turned the tables on him. Instead of engaging in a traditional duel, Musashi used his wits, his body language, and his unexpected appearance to confuse his opponent, making him second-guess every move. The idea of using disguises wasn't about tricking people into thinking they were dealing with someone they weren't. It was more about changing the way they viewed the fight. The samurai were masters of perception, and they knew that a duel wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about how your opponent perceived you. If you could control that perception, you'd already be one step ahead. Of course. This kind of psychological warfare wasn't limited to Musashi. Samurai throughout history employed similar tactics, using their attire, demeanor, and even the time of day to mess with their opponent's expectations. By appearing different than expected, they could make their enemies hesitate, making it easier to strike when the time was right. Now, let's switch things up and talk about unexpected weapon choices. We've seen the samurai use a range of psychological tricks and sneaky tactics, but sometimes the weapons themselves were as unconventional as their strategies. Most people think of a samurai's weapon as the iconic katana, the blade that seems to define the entire warrior class. But in reality, samurai were known to use a surprising array of tools to settle disputes and win duels. And I'm not just talking about the occasional bow or spear, no. There are some real oddities in the mix. One of the most curious weapon choices was the tanto, a small dagger that was often used as a backup weapon. It's easy to overlook the tanto after all. In a world full of massive, sharp swords, a small blade seems almost, well, insignificant. But that's where the samurai's tactical mind came into play. A tanto was perfect for close quarters combat, and the element of surprise it brought to the table was invaluable. Imagine a duel that's going one way when suddenly your opponent pulls out a dagger that you didn't even see coming. It's fast, it's deadly, and it could turn the entire fight on its head. Historians still argue whether the tanto was primarily used in duels or more for everyday defense. Some believe it was meant for more practical purposes like self-defense. When a samurai found themselves unarmed, but others contend that it had a place in formal duels, especially when there was a risk of a drawn-out battle. Either way, the tanto's small size was one of its greatest assets. It allowed the samurai to fight in tight spaces and close combat situations, which, as you can imagine, could be a game changer in a duel where the slightest move could determine the victor. But it's not just the tanto that's worth mentioning. Some samurai also carried around a wakizashi, a shorter sword that was often paired with the katana. But here's the kicker. Some samurai didn't even use the wakizashi as a secondary weapon. It was sometimes used in duels as the primary tool of choice. The idea was that the shorter blade offered more speed and maneuverability, giving the samurai an edge in tight, fast-paced duels. A katana might be great for a longer reach. But when the fight gets up close and personal, the wakizashi was perfect for quick, precise strikes. And let's not forget the naginata, a pole weapon with a blade at the end that resembles a spear crossed with a scythe. This weapon wasn't as common in one-on-one samurai duels, but it was sometimes used by samurai in battles or skirmishes, where they needed to control a larger area. It's certainly not something you'd typically see in the hands of a lone swordsman in a traditional duel, but the sheer size and reach of the naginata made it a force to be reckoned with. A samurai wielding a naginata in a duel could easily keep an opponent at a distance, using the long pole to sweep or strike with great force. Historians still debate the role of these non-katana weapons in duels. Some argue that they were simply backup tools used in specific situations, while others believe they were just as important as the katana itself in certain types of combat. What's undeniable, though, is that samurai were never one-dimensional fighters. They understood that flexibility and adaptability in the heat of battle were just as important as raw skill. And whether it was a tano, a wakizashi, or a naginata, these unusual weapons were just another way for the samurai to keep their opponents guessing. In the end, what made these weapons so effective wasn't just their physical attributes, it was the psychological effect they had on their opponents. Imagine facing off against someone holding a sword, and suddenly they pull out a small dagger, or a different weapon entirely. That unexpected shift forces you to reassess everything you thought you knew about the duel. The samurai knew this, and they used it to their advantage, making sure that the fight was never predictable. Now that we've looked at weapons and psychological tricks, let's talk about the role of misdirection in a samurai duel. This is the classic look over their tactic only with swords, ancient customs, and a deep understanding of human behavior. While samurai were experts in physical combat, they also knew that sometimes the real key to victory was making your opponent think. They knew what was coming, only to deliver something completely unexpected. And to do this, samurai were experts at directing attention in ways that would leave their opponent vulnerable. Take the concept of feints, for example. A feint is essentially a fake move, something designed to make the opponent react in a way that sets them up for a real strike. Sounds simple enough, right? But what's fascinating about samurai feints is that they didn't always follow the traditional swing a little to the left and then strike to the right routine that you might imagine. No, samurai feints were often much more subtle. A slight change in posture, a shift in gaze, a tiny step backward, all of these things could signal a feint. But the beauty of it was that the samurai didn't always need to use their sword to trick the opponent. Sometimes it was just about using their body language to suggest one thing while preparing to do the opposite. Historians still argue over whether this particular style of feigning was formally taught or if it was just something some samurai mastered on their own through experience. Some believe that samurai schools spent years honing these deceptive techniques, while others suggest that they were often self-taught, learning through personal experience and trial and error. Regardless, feints were a key part of the samurai's arsenal in the heat of battle. When you're already tired, stressed, and trying to outthink your opponent, a well-timed feint could make the difference between victory and defeat. Of course, misdirection wasn't limited to physical movements. Some samurai would use verbal misdirection to distract or confuse their opponent. They might speak in riddles or cryptic phrases, forcing their adversary to try to decipher what they were saying, all while preparing their next strike. Imagine being in the middle of a duel, trying to focus on your opponent's movements, and then hearing them say something like, "The cherry blossoms fall when the moon is high, but only the wise man knows why." What do you do with that? Are they trying to confuse you? Throw you off? Or is there some hidden meaning you're supposed to grasp? This tactic is another example of how samurai used mental games to disarm their opponents, just as much as their physical skills. In many cases, it wasn't just about the sword, it was about how the samurai manipulated the situation itself. Through feints, strange movements, and cryptic speech, they could make their opponent doubt their senses, question their own actions, and most importantly, second-guess their next move. But there's something even deeper going on with this whole idea of misdirection. It's not just about distracting your opponent. It's about controlling their focus. By drawing their attention to one thing you can set them up to fail in the next moment. You're not just manipulating their body, you're manipulating their mind. In a world where the smallest slip could mean death, this mental manipulation was just as crucial as physical skill. This idea of misdirection wasn't just restricted to duels. In fact, it was a concept that permeated samurai culture in general. Whether it was during a formal challenge or in the midst of a more informal conflict, samurai knew that being able to direct and misdirect attention could give them the upper hand. And once again, this all comes back to that central idea. Samurai didn't just fight, they strategized on multiple levels, using everything they had at their disposal to control the battle, both mentally and physically. At this point, you've probably started to realize that a duel between two samurai wasn't just about brute force. It was about an entire system of tricks, mind games, and calculated risks. But let's take things up a notch now. Imagine you're deep in a duel, weapons clashing, sweat dripping down your face, and you suddenly hear the sound of footsteps. What do? Well, in a traditional samurai duel, that's often when things got even more strange. Some samurai would deliberately interrupt the rhythm of the duel by adding in unexpected elements, like making noise on purpose, shifting position, or even incorporating environmental factors. Think about it during a formal duel. Every move counts. If your opponent is focused entirely on your every swing, then one extra sound, one unexpected shift in the environment could throw them off, just enough to gain an advantage. This wasn't just about swinging your sword, it was about creating disruption. The samurai understood that by controlling their surroundings, they could influence the very atmosphere of the duel. Take, for instance, the concept of kai, the battle cry. This loud shout was used to focus energy and intimidate the opponent. But it wasn't just about yelling loudly. The way a samurai timed their kai could create an unsettling moment, causing their opponent to pause or become disoriented. But sometimes, samurai would use their own silence to throw off their opponent. A duel with no words, no battle cries, just the sounds of swords clashing could be disorienting. In fact, some samurai believed that the absence of sound was an even more powerful psychological weapon than the kai. They might deliberately hold their breath or make almost no noise, heightening the tension and putting pressure on their opponent to act first. Historians still argue whether silence was consciously taught as a tactic or if it simply emerged through personal experience. Some believe samurai were trained to control their breath and minimize extraneous noise during combat, making them appear even more like cold, calculating warriors. Others suggest it was more instinctive and natural response to the high-stress environment of a duel where every moment was vital. But it wasn't just silence and noise that created these subtle disruptions. The samurai were also keenly aware of environmental factors like weather, terrain, and timing. A skilled samurai might choose the location of the duel for the sole purpose of taking advantage of the natural elements. A patch of slick, muddy ground could make a sudden lunge dangerous for the opponent, while the sound of a heavy rain might mask the sound of a blade coming in for a strike. Timing, too, played a critical role. Some samurai would purposefully challenge their opponent at dusk or in the early morning, knowing that the dimming light could obscure a vital move, creating a brief window of uncertainty. This all ties into the samurai's deep understanding of how perception worked. It wasn't just the visual perception of their opponent, it was everything around them. In the heat of a duel, a slight change in the weather, a shift in the air, or even the sound of a distant animal could play a huge part in how the fight unfolded. And samurai, being masters of their craft, knew how to manipulate this. They weren't just fighting in a vacuum. They were constantly influencing the environment to their advantage, ensuring that every moment in the duel was stacked in their favor dot at its core. This tactic of environmental manipulation reflects the samurai's holistic approach to combat. It wasn't just about what happened in the immediate moments of the duel. It was about the larger atmosphere, the conditions that made the fight feel almost inevitable, where the environment itself seemed to conspire in the samurai's favor. So, now that we've covered the more psychological and tactical aspects of samurai dueling, let's shift gears and talk about something that may surprise you: the role of honor in these face-offs. Yes, we all know that samurai were deeply committed to maintaining their honor. But what you might not realize is that this obsession with honor often led to some peculiar choices during duels. In fact, there were times when samurai would willingly put themselves at a disadvantage just to follow the rigid codes of honor sometimes, almost to a ridiculous extent. Take, for example, the concept of the formal challenge. In a world where you could just as easily sneak up on your opponent and get the jump on them, samurai would often engage in duels that were preceded by elaborate rituals and polite exchanges. Imagine, if you will, that you're about to duel someone, and instead of just charging in with swords drawn, you have to stand there, bow, exchange formal pleasantries, and wait for the other person to accept your challenge. Now, this sounds nice and civilized, but here's the kicker. During this time, you're completely exposed. Your opponent can size you up, determine your fighting style, and mentally prepare. And yet, the code of honor demanded that you wait for that moment of acceptance. Historians still argue whether this level of formality in dueling was universal, or whether it was just reserved for high-status samurai. Some suggest that lower-ranked samurai might bypass such rituals and jump straight into the fight, while others insist that all samurai, regardless of rank, adhere to these codes. But one thing is clear: this formal approach to dueling was a perfect example of how honor often trumped practical advantage. Yuku,